Camille looked at the fire and thought about the fact that this was their last summer. The exams were over, and the classmates had decided to celebrate them with a camping trip with a sleepover. In a few days, they were going to have a graduation party. The girl was immersed in herself and did not notice Stephen staring at her intently. He had long sighed for Camille, but she had already refused to meet him in person several times, and maybe that would have been the end of it. But the guy was the kind of man who was used to getting his way. He saw Camille as a trophy that should belong only to him. The son of wealthy people, he was always bathed in the attention of girls. And Stephen was good-looking. How many times had he shown his school group notes that someone had planted on him? Listen to this. He'd tune in and start reading with a serious look. "Stephen, I love you so much I'd do anything for you." The guy laughed. "What an idiot." "Stephen, why would you do that?" Camille said to him. "Maybe the girl really loves you." "I'm so sick of all these lovers," he sighed. "After all, I'm alone. How are they going to divide me up?" He joked, and all the guys laughed. "How is that funny? You go up to them on purpose, complimenting them, and when a girl falls in love, they always saw Stephen as a peacock with a loose tail. In fact, he turned out not to be such a hero." One day he and his class went to the regional park. There, by chance, one boy discovered a snake near Stephen. The latter shouted so that the leaves of the trees rose to the ground in terror. "Get it away from me," he shouted. "Help. She's begging me now. Somebody save me." The classmates rushed to him and, to their surprise, found yellow spots on the snake's head. "He's not sorry, he doesn't have any venom." A high school student took the snake in his hands. "Look, he's got a horror on his arm, put it away." Stephen was hysterical. "I don't want to see him, I have to kill him." He grabbed a cow nearby and with all his might hit his husband, who had already been released. "Are you crazy?" Camille stood up for the animal, but it was too late. It was bleeding. "You idiot." From that day on, they tried to avoid Stephen. He was always imposing on her. On the camping trip, he was already approaching the girl and pouring his love vibes on her. "Stephen, I don't love you." For the umpteenth time, Camille answered him. "Please, let's have a good time." It was already dark. The embers of the fire burned red in the night. The tents had long been prepared, but no one was going to go to bed. The guys were talking, singing songs. They had chosen a very beautiful place. On a hill next to a ravine, a beautiful picture opened up. The sleeping city looked down on them. Camille got up from the log and walked to the side of the hill. Everyone was so busy that no one noticed where she went. Only Stephen was watching closely. He led the way back first, then went behind the bushes. That way he could no longer be seen, and headed in the direction in which Camille had gone. She stood almost at the very edge. The wide road was surrounded on each side by trees and bushes. Stephen watched the girl from his ambush for several minutes. A plan quickly matured in his mind. The boy crept cautiously up behind her, putting a hood over his head so that Camille would not recognize him. He was determined to get her that night at any cost. He abruptly grabbed Camille from behind, covering her mouth with his hand. The girl couldn't even move. Stephen wanted to drag her into the thick bushes to do his thing. But they managed to break free. She bent forward hard and did not hold on over the cliff. A moment more, and the girl flew down. Stephen heard the crunch of twigs. Fear paralyzed him. He could not move. At that moment, he did not know what to do. He cautiously walked back, sat back down in his seat. No one seemed to notice his absence. The young men were still sitting there, talking. Stephen was all pale. Many thoughts came into his head. At first, he wanted to tell everyone that it had fallen. But then he would have to confess what he wanted to do to her. This was something that the self-loving and selfish Stephen could not do. A classmate picked up a guitar and everyone sang along. Stephen opened his mouth too. He needed to play it off as if nothing had happened. She felt like she was flying somewhere. It happened so fast she didn't even have time to scream. She felt the branches start up. And then a hard blow, and the girl lost consciousness. "Shit," someone swore. A silhouette ran up to the platform, which was hidden from prying eyes by numerous trees. Alive. The man touched the wounded neck. Somehow, miraculously, the stranger had not had time to remove the bale of straw he had brought today. It had saved the girl's life. What am I going to do with her? The man thought. I can't call an ambulance. They'll know where I am. And if I leave her here, she'll die." The stranger looked around. He knew this place very well. He had no choice but to take the girl to the clearing. She could easily be found there. He carefully lifted the victim and carried her through his secret passages into the open. It was already dark, no one had seen him, and no one knew anyone was hiding here. Even if the cave had been discovered, he wouldn't have been found. There were several secret rooms here that only he knew about. Some lights flickered on. The stranger shuddered. Then he heard voices. "Camille," he heard. "Where are you?" The voices came from different directions. It seemed that the girl was not far from him. "I'd better leave her here," the man thought, "otherwise they'll see me." He left the place in a hurry. The boys were about to go to bed in their tents and found Camille missing. "I'll go look for her." Stephen volunteered. "Don't worry, I'll find her." He declared arrogantly. "Stephen, we should all go look for her," immediately said the other guys. Stephen shined the light of his flashlight on the ground. He had knowingly sent his classmates on a false trail. The boy was insanely afraid to go down, so he decided to explore the open side of the hill first. Camille saw something lying on the hill and immediately ran up to it, took the girl in his arms and carried her to their camp. The boys had not yet arrived. Stephen laid the classmate down next to the fire and noticed that she was covered in blood. "Stephen, did you find her?" He heard behind him. "Guys, come here," the boy shouted loudly. "Yeah, I went down into the ravine and pulled her out. She was stuck." Stephen was making up a legend as he went along. His hands were all torn off. He showed the blood he had left from the main body. "We need to call an ambulance right away, or she'll die." An hour later, Camille was on her way to the nearest emergency room. She still hadn't regained consciousness. Her classmates immediately informed her parents. "God," sobbed her mother, "we didn't want to let you go there. God knows who walks there at night." All the classmates were very worried about the girl. They were waiting in the emergency room. "If it wasn't for Stephen, we wouldn't have found her," said one boy, Stephen. "You're good, you're a real hero. Went out in the pitch black and found her." Everyone cheered him on. Stephen sat all red. He was flattered by their recognition. Yes, it was based on a lie, but still, the guy didn't mind. It was almost 3, and the young people began to go home. They never heard the news that Camille had come to her senses. It happened the next day. No one was allowed to see the girl except her parents. As soon as she was able to speak, the police were called, and she told them everything. "Did you see who attacked you?" The investigator asked her right away. "Any details, perhaps?" "No," she shook her head in the negative. "He grabbed me from behind. I couldn't turn around. What makes you think it was him and not her?" The policeman asked a tricky question. Well, first of all, only men have such strong arms, Camille thought. Secondly, if it was a woman, I think I would have felt her breasts with my back. Suppose it was a man, continued the investigator. What did he want? If he wanted to throw you down the cliff, he would have just pushed you. I felt him start to pull me into the bushes. Camille blushed. If I hadn't managed to free myself for a moment, he would have done it. So he wanted to either steal you or rape you. The investigator wrote something in his notebook. Could you describe how you felt his hands, the clothes the attacker was wearing? I don't know. All I can tell you is that it was a man. It happened so fast, I didn't have time to think about anything. Canine units went to the scene with dogs, covered all the hills. They found some kind of cave. Apparently someone had been there recently. The dog kept barking at the far wall. The cops searched it, but they didn't find anything suspicious. But keep barking, the man muttered to himself. You won't get in here. He smiled contentedly. The policeman took one last look at the cave and started to get out of it. It was a difficult place to get in. You could say it was located on a sheer cliff. The investigation ended with nothing being found. They said that the man who had attacked her had probably escaped and was somewhere else. And since no more signs were found, the case was closed. It should be said that all the classmates were questioned, and all of them said that at that moment no one had gone anywhere except Camille. The guys visited her almost every day. When the girl was moved to a regular ward, Camille Stephen is our real hero, her classmates told her. He saved you. If it wasn't for Stephen, no one knows if you'd still be alive or not. and the hero himself came to see her a few times too. And not empty-handed. His parents' money allowed them to buy Camille expensive bouquets of flowers and full bags of groceries. Whether Stephen was playing games or wanted to take advantage of the opportunity, the boy decided not to back down. "Camille, I love you," he once told her. "If you hadn't survived, I wouldn't have been able to live without you." The girl was silent. She didn't know what to say to him. After he had saved her, her opinion of him had changed dramatically. "Stephen, thank you for helping me. If it hadn't been for you." Tears ran down her cheeks. After the hospital, Camille and Stephen started dating. The girl was from an ordinary family, but Stephen's parents helped her to enter the institute. It so happened that she and Stephen studied together, and in the 4th year they had a big wedding. Camille sat there all confused. The wedding was paid for by the groom's parents. She did not like it all. The girl would have preferred to do with a simple registration, but the position of Stephen's parents obliged. The bride looked at her relatives with despair in her eyes. Her father and mother, too, felt as if they were out of place. The wedding was being held in a country mansion that Stephen's father had recently purchased. The whole thing was dragging Camille. When they graduated from high school, the boy's father was a middleman. He kept a few stores, but in recent years he'd gotten a lot of promotion, and the girl didn't like all that pomp. "Stephen, I'm begging you, let's move out of here. I want to work." "I cannot sit on your parents' neck until the wedding," asked the groom Camille. "Camille, what kind of work can there be?" he said grudgingly. "I'm sorry my dad has so much money. I mean, you have to spend it somewhere. But I want to earn my own." Camille objected. "I'll work anyway." "Please don't stop me." In fact, after Camille started dating Stephen, her life took a completely different turn. She didn't want to study finance, but the guy's father insisted on his understanding. It was one of the most prestigious professions. Camille agonized for 5 years to get a diploma. Stephen often missed classes, as he liked to sleep before the wedding. Camille clearly felt as if she was being sucked into some black hole. "I must be incapable of feeling gratitude," she shamed herself. "Stephen and his parents have done so much for me. And I'm always dissatisfied with something." The parents realized that this was a big opportunity for Camille Stephen. Their daughter would be well off for the rest of her life. "Camille, you can see how much he loves you," Mom reassured her daughter. "Soon you will have children, and they will pay you even more." The girl couldn't explain what was wrong. She kept getting some inner impulses, but she couldn't understand them. And yet Camille managed to get something out of it. Stephen agreed to let his wife finish some courses and do something for herself. "I envy you," her friend Lisa once told her. "You're the only one in our class with such a romantic history. Who knows if you'd be married if you hadn't had that tragedy then? Stephen has all the money, the beauty, the charm. Camille, you're behind him like a stone wall." "I'd be in a coven with the one I love," sighed the girl. "I'm only 24. I feel like my life is over." "That's silly," laughed her friend. "Yes, in your place so many girls would like to be. You live and be happy. But what's the problem? Don't you love Stephen?" "Yes, I do," Camille answered right away. But again, she could not find the right words to describe what was happening to her. "In your case, there may not be any, but you realize that." "A jam," Lisa echoed. "You go ahead and get pregnant sooner rather than later. You already have an official family, so it's time for you to think about children." As it happened, Lisa got married a year later. She moved in with her husband in a neighboring town. "What will I do without you?" Camille sobbed. "Now, you and I won't see each other at all." "Camille, what's this nonsense?" Her friend hugged her. "We're only 100 kilometers apart. Now, you'll have a reason to learn to drive. Will you come visit me?" The girls often talked on the phone, but it couldn't replace face-to-face meetings. Camille suffered a lot. She was a very reserved person. Was it hard for her to make friends? 6 months ago, Camille managed to persuade Stephen to move out of his parents' house. She always felt uncomfortable there. To be honest, Camille couldn't tell anyone that her father-in-law and mother-in-law were not as friendly as they seemed at first glance. The daughter-in-law was particularly struck by the way they dealt with their servants. The richer Stephen's father became, the more arrogant and vain his antics became. "Camille, what kindergarten is this? How can you understand it? Do you feel uncomfortable here?" Stephen's husband was indignant. I want to manage the household myself, to take care of the family. You don't let me work. Camille tried to start from afar, and here I can't prove myself. I'm sorry, but I don't want strangers washing dishes for me. The husband finally agreed, and the couple moved into a small house. Camille felt happy for the first time in a long time. She was free. But almost immediately afterward, Stephen's life changed. In his father's house, he didn't feel like a master until the end either. To Camille, his behavior was strange. Stephen was terrified somewhere. She looked at her drunken husband. For some reason, he didn't tell me anything. Do I have to report to you that I'm sitting with my friends? In memorable language, he replied. Camille, it's my own business. His words hurt his heart. His wife helped him undress. Stephen had been drinking before, but he usually told her about his meetings. Let's lie still, his wife said. Here, I'll help you take off your sweater. Leave me alone, Stephen protested. I'll do it myself. He began to pull back the sleeves of the sweater. Camille sighed and sat down next to him on the bed. She was in pain and wanted to cry. Camille, do you know who wanted to rape you? Suddenly her husband said. You have no idea who. Camille turned pale. She stared at him intently, and he smiled contentedly. And I won't tell you. He laughed. It's my secret. I saw him. Your rapist. Camille didn't listen to his nonsense. After about 20 minutes, Stephen fell asleep. Camille got tired and went to the kitchen. She sat in a chair and sobbed. Why did he marry me? She thought. I'm like some kind of toy. When he wanted to, he played with it. When he got bored, he left me. The next day, Stephen got up with a sore head. He kept moaning and asking his wife for pills. Stephen? Camille asked him that evening. Did you tell me yesterday that you knew who wanted to rape me? Yes, I was drunk. He turned pale and didn't know what he was saying. Get me a mineral water. Sitting with friends began to clear up. Camille began to worry about her husband. She decided to have a serious talk with him. What are you doing? Stephen was indignant. We live one life, so let me enjoy it to the fullest. Stephen, you are a grown man. You should be responsible for your behavior, she said calmly. I don't owe anyone anything. He said arrogantly. I have money and I live as I want. But I understand that you can go out with your friends, but that doesn't mean you should get drunk with them. She wouldn't give up. Camille, is there something missing? He looked at his wife, who shook her head no. Well, enjoy your life. So you're suggesting I go to nightclubs and look for men? She couldn't help herself. Well, if that's what makes you happy, he gave her an angry look. Then I made the wrong choice. Stephen turned the whole thing around so that now Camille looked like a walking woman. Tell me normal life isn't for you. Her husband had found her weak spot. So I work, I provide for our family. And you dream of a completely different life. You idiot. Camille shouted through her tears and went to her room. Stephen didn't mind, and he'd been seeing Emily for almost 3 months. She was an emotional girl. They fought a lot, and Stephen would get jealous and get drunk in a bar somewhere. She didn't feel like she was in a cage. It was like Stephen had locked her in there on purpose. Then she felt like she couldn't get out. Listen, Camille, you should have a baby, Lisa advised her over the phone. That way responsibility would come to him. Money has ruined many destinies. Your Stephen is no exception. Lisa, it's not working out. I'm planning all this. And then Stephen's not home, and then he's drunk again. A friend cried. I don't know what to do, but give him a romantic week, Lisa suggested to seduce him. You're lucky. You're already 7 months pregnant, she said. I don't think we're ever going to have a family or kids. Give it all up, she ordered her friend. Everything will be fine. I'm sure Stephen loves you. Why else would he be living with you? I don't know. I don't understand him, Camille replied. Sometimes I think our marriage was a mistake. Camille decided to take her friend's advice and arranged a romantic weekend evening for her husband. She thought he was pleased. Stephen, I love you. His wife said to him, I want us to be happy. Are we not living well? He was surprised. We have a perfect family, and soon we will have children. Tell me, who would you like first, a boy or a girl? My wife smiled, and I do not care. He replied dryly. What difference does it make? The main thing is to be born healthy. After that evening, Camille had a glimmer of hope. It seemed to her that Stephen loved her. Yes, and he told her he wanted children. Stephen didn't know what he wanted out of life. He didn't want to let go of Camille, but Emily meant a lot to him. Of course, there had been other girls before her, but Emily had touched his heart. Stephen was not the kind of man to settle for little. He was good-looking, so he was never going to settle for one wife. He needed Camille as direct proof that he had a decent family. His wife was completely devoted to him, so no one could say anything bad about her. Still, it was important for Stephen to be well spoken of. If Camille had been a blonde instead, the gossip would have gotten to him by now. A faithful wife for the home, he thought, and for the body, a beautiful mistress. Then a man could be himself, and some of Stephen's acquaintances shared this view. His friends were not poor people, and they all had mistresses. "Stephen, how can you do without them?" An acquaintance said to him when they were relaxing in the sauna, "Status obliges, and all this whining about being faithful to your wife. And where does it end? Scandals. But I've been with my mistress, and I feel good. So I don't react to my wife's whims, and if it weren't for my Tanya, I'd have divorced my wife long ago. She's unbearable." While Stephen was indulging in his pleasures, his life took an unexpected turn. Stephen once told him, "Emily, I'm pregnant, it's too late, I can't have an abortion." The way he opened his mouth in horror. "Why don't we make a deal with the doctor?" "I'll pay." The girl shook her head negatively. She was no different from the other applicants. She had a cloudless life in her dreams, if she married Stephen. So during this time, Emily had made every attempt at blackmail and manipulation, and it seemed that Stephen was ready to leave his wife. But he either lacked courage or he actually felt affection for her somewhere deep inside. Emily finally decided to have a baby. She really didn't want to go down that road. She was 22, and she didn't want to burden herself with such a heavy burden. But Stephen still hadn't made up his mind, and she needed to act urgently. The man was not particularly happy about the news of the baby, but he did not take it seriously at first. And Emily wasn't about to back down. "Stephen, when are you going to talk to your wife? Otherwise, I'll do it myself." Blackmailed his mistress, stroking her belly. "Mind your own business." He answered her coldly, "I'll talk to her myself." The second blow was that by some miracle, Emily and Stephen were going to have twins. "Emily, can't you get an abortion? Please," her lover begged. "Where are the twins going? It's a good thing." Camille protested. "You'll have a son and a daughter. It's a ready-made family." After that, Stephen could no longer deny that he had been playing around. He did everything he could to keep his wife from getting pregnant. But with Emily, it came so easily. For almost a week, Stephen thought about how he should proceed. He clearly realized that he did not want to divorce Camille. He had a strange attitude toward her. He saw her as some kind of property that should always belong to him. Besides, Camille was the only girl who had ever turned him down. And if it hadn't been for that incident, Stephen would never have married her. Perhaps for him it was a kind of revenge for the fact that she had rejected him at school. Anyway, the man realized that he would not leave his wife. But what about Emily? All right, she gives birth to those children. And then what? It does not mean that I should marry her, he thought. I'll give her money for the kids. Or if we break up and she files for alimony, well, then I'll pay. But Emily's plans went much further in her imagination. She wasn't going to stop at handouts. She made her first diversion. One day she looked up Camille's number on Stephen's phone and, without telling him, texted her. "I know for a fact that your husband has a mistress," the message said, "and he loves her very much. They will soon have a child together." Camille barely finished the text message. Everything in front of her eyes went blurry. She sat down in the chair. Tears ran down her cheeks. For the first 20 minutes she had no energy at all and just cried. With great difficulty, Camille waited for Stephen. Her whole face was swollen. Her wife didn't want to have this conversation on the phone. "Camille, what happened?" Her husband was scared. "Are you not feeling well?" He came to her. "Stephen, I know everything." She barely spoke. "That you have a mistress and that she's pregnant. And so we don't have to talk about it. Just read this." Stephen cast a quick glance at her phone. He turned very pale at first, but quickly pulled himself together. "What is this nonsense? Did you call this number?" Immediately he asked, "But I'll set you up in a moment." He pressed the call, but there were short beeps. Naturally, the number was blocked. "Stephen, but if you don't want me, why all this masquerade?" "I want to divorce you," Camille cried. "It's all a lie. Somebody's just jealous of our happiness." He hugged his wife. "But if I didn't love you, I wouldn't be living with you. What's the point?" Camille looked at him doubtfully. She didn't know what to believe. She already felt that things were not working out between her and Stephen. So the mistress option was very possible. "Camille, I can't live without you," Stephen said in a stinging voice. "I don't need anyone but you." "You lie." Strictly, she looked him in the eyes. "Stephen, I don't believe you. You said yourself that you have the right to live your own life. But going out with friends and drinking is one thing. But family is sacred to me." He objected. "Camille, I'm sure someone is jealous of you or of us, so they want to take revenge in such a vile way." After this conversation, Stephen became more attentive to his wife. The fear of losing her kept him on his toes. Who could have done it? He tried all sorts of people in his mind. Maybe one of the guys had whistled an antenna at a party sometime and texted her. No, they know about Emily, but none of them know she's pregnant. At least I didn't mention it. It's not hard to find out, though. Stephen did not think much about it, but the problem with the mistress arose with renewed vigor. Camille, on the contrary, after this conversation began to feel more and more threatened. She still did not trust Stephen. She felt that everything was inevitably heading towards a denouement for which she needed to prepare herself. The day came and Emily gave birth to twins just as she had wanted. She had a boy and a girl. The only thing that saved the girl was that she lived in another city. Stephen deliberately looked for mistresses somewhere away from his wife. He bought her a one-room apartment and everything she needed for the children. Since for Camille her husband was always at work, he could easily disappear for days on end. He and his father promoted more and more year after year. And now they had a whole chain of stores in several nearby towns. Stephen took Emily from the maternity hospital without much enthusiasm. The girl did everything she could to turn his attention to the children. After her text message didn't work properly, Emily put the question to Stephen, "Either you divorce your grade or I leave. And remember, kids you'll never see," she threatened. "Emily, then neither will you. Remember, you'll leave me with nothing, and I won't pay your rent anymore. So you can only count on alimony. And trust me, you won't make much, as you know." "I have good connections," he replied calmly. Emily realized that she wouldn't be satisfied, but she didn't want to be left with nothing either, especially on her hands with 2 children. The girl agreed to Stephen's terms. She still hoped that he would get attached to his son and daughter and divorce his wife. The tangle of passions was getting tighter and tighter. And no one realized how it was unraveling. Camille was in a deep depression. She had already talked to Stephen several times, but he assured her each time that he needed her and that he loved only her. Lisa had a daughter and Camille decided to go and see her. She did not tell Stephen that she was going to see her friend. She just said she was going to stay with her parents for a few days. Her husband decided to take advantage of this opportunity and went to see Emily. She had been making a scene for a week for him to visit her and the kids. Stephen drove to the neighboring town and thought about how he could get rid of his mistress. His passion for her was gone. For the children he felt no affection. "I must talk to her," he said to himself. There was no point in dragging it out any longer. "I think Camille and I need a child. Then she'll calm down and leave me alone. I'll pay her kids money so they won't go without food. They have a place to live, that's all. I'm done." Dad arrived. Emily opened the door and threw herself at her lover's neck. "Stephen, come in." The guest barely smiled. Emily immediately thrust her son into his arms. She had already dressed the children. "Stephen, we urgently need to go shopping." Emily tried not to miss her chance. The kids need clothes to buy and food too. "And then you're in for a surprise." She winked mysteriously. Stephen was not tempted. His feelings for Emily had faded. He agreed to take them to the mall. Emily, with her lover from the double stroller, already ran through a few stores. "Emily, I'll wait for you outside," Stephen said tiredly. "I'm sick of climbing here already." "All right," she smiled. "Then you and the kids and sit on the bench near the entrance, and I'll quickly buy what's left. Don't be afraid. They're asleep. Stephen did not agree for a long time, but when Emily threatened him that they would be there for another 3 hours, he took the stroller and headed for the exit. Camille did not want to go to Lisa's house empty-handed. She decided to run into the mall. The woman had already picked out a couple sets of baby clothes. Satisfied, she headed towards the exit. She hesitated briefly on the steps and started to turn the other way when she heard a woman's voice yell Stephen. She turned around sharply and noticed her husband sitting on the bench. In his hands was a baby stroller. A girl who had apparently been yelling to him approached him and immediately pounced on him. Camille nestled against the side wall. She couldn't figure out what she should do now. The pain caused tears to rush down her face. So it had all turned out to be true, she whispered. I won't make a scandal. We'll talk to him at home. The meeting with her friend was fleeting. Camille cried all the time. Lisa tried to cheer her up a little. A friend was standing by the window, calling her on the phone. Lisa said, "Leave him, and then wait until he throws you out," she said. "Lisa, I can't understand him, but if you don't need me, why do you keep me?" "Why lie?" Camille sobbed. "I'm sorry, but I'll speak out," replied her friend rudely. "You know, a feline who has this next tree, you don't care about him at all. The main thing is that others know that this tree is his. The same thing and some men are not able to love, so they compensate for it by keeping around them faithful wives who for many years tolerate their cheating. But every time they're about to leave them, they crawl on their knees and wash themselves with tears, just so the wife doesn't leave. And for the first 2 months, they are the most perfect husbands in the world. And then it starts all over again. But the worst thing is that they are good manipulators, will threaten that they will kill themselves, that they will go on principle, and that something there will do. But as they say, they don't have the guts, and the poor wife continues to suffer because she doesn't want to take that sin on her soul. Well, maybe you're right. I too am sometimes afraid that if I divorce Stephen, my guilt will kill me, Camille sighed. But after what I saw today, he's not going to stop me. Camille boarded the shuttle bus. She didn't drive and spent the whole ride thinking about what had happened. God, so many years wasted on him, and it's all pointless. She looked out the window. It ended in pain and emptiness. She arrived home and began to prepare to talk to her husband. She was already packing all the things she needed. She couldn't stay in this house any longer. It was all over for her. Let him do whatever he wants with himself. I won't be responsible for it, she convinced herself. Even if he slits his wrists in front of me, it will be on his conscience. But Camille was wrong. Stephen wasn't the kind of man who would just kill himself. He could play that kind of comedy. But to do it in real life, definitely not. The wait was long. Camille didn't want to go to her parents. She decided to spend the night in a hotel and then think about where to go next. Stephen arrived around 9 o'clock. He wasn't in the mood either. She could smell the alcohol. She didn't really feel like talking to him when he was drunk. But the woman was determined to talk, and she wasn't going to back down. "Stephen, we need to have a serious talk," the wife said dryly. "It's very important." "Camille, let's do it later." He tried to evade. The situation with Emily was not yet under control, and it was wearing him out. "I'm leaving," Stephen's wife said coldly. "I will divorce you, and for a very good reason." "What is it?" he asked angrily. "Camille Netrebko, I'm nervous. I'm already tired today. I've got some serious problems. Yes, I've seen what you've been busy with. Tired from the stroller with 2 kids. Do you look like a dad? Not so much?" The wife snapped at him. He turned pale. He couldn't understand how Camille knew that he had children and that he had spent time with them today. "What the hell are you talking about? We had an emergency at the store. I was there all day." Stephen denied it. "Look, come on. I saw you with my own eyes outside the mall with a stroller," screamed Camille. "I can even describe your mistress to you in general terms." Camille drew a portrait. "You cheated on me? Stephen, you've never had a conscience. Do you really think I could forgive you for that?" "That's enough," he whispered in rage. "Who are you to tell me how to live my life? Need I remind you that you've been on my back all these years? You mean you're going to give me a hard time about it now? First you forbid me to work, and now you want to make me feel guilty." My wife couldn't speak calmly. "I didn't need your money, and I never needed you. You never had any dignity. You can't act like a man. Watch your mouth. It was you I never needed, you fool," scolded Stephen. "I've played you like a doll all these years, and you pretended not to notice. You're the one with no dignity because you sold it for my money. You thought you had a good life. Remember, I'm not going to let you play games with me. You're nothing. I'll never set foot in this house again. You betrayed me, not me betraying you. You've fallen so low. You chase after every skirt. You're incapable of being a husband and a father. And I'm glad it's over. I'm going to get my bags. Wife's an idiot. I'm the only one who needs you. Look at you." Stephen jumped in front of her. "And if you must know, it was me who almost raped you." He laughed. "And you, stupid, married me. You've been playing my game this whole time. And the funny thing about this whole story is that I never rescued you. I just found you near our camp, so I got mine. You were mine." Camille was pale. She quickly grabbed her bags and suitcases and ran out of the house. Her body was shaking and she barely hailed a cab. "God, what a bastard," she whispered. He had set this whole thing up. After all, he'd always been a heartless creature. How could I have believed he'd saved me then? Camille's epiphany was very painful. She only wanted to run. She walked quickly toward the highway and kept looking back. It seemed to her that Stephen was following her. But she was alone in the street. She was so excited that she called a cab to her house. Out of stress, she turned off her cell phone. She was taking along the road towards the center and didn't know what she was doing. She was in a state of shock. She wasn't confused by the lights of the cars that were hitting her face. He was the one who wanted to rape me. A pounding rattled in her temples. I married a rapist. God, what a nightmare. She slowly took the suitcase forward, all the while tugging, into a layer of dust and rocks. There was a rumbling sound in the distance. Camille paid no attention to it. She was approaching a small bend in the road. The sound was growing, what sounded like a scraping noise. It made the woman come to her senses and she turned around. But it was too late. The headlights blinded her and she felt the impact. The driver jumped out and saw a man lying on the side of the road. Quickly he skidded backwards and, pushing top speed, fled the scene. Camille lay there and looked up at the starry sky. She felt a strong pain, but she couldn't tell exactly where it was. "Help." She moved her lips. "I'm dying." A ringing sound appeared in her ears. Then flashes appeared before her eyes, and Camille lost consciousness. Christopher turned the steering wheel tiredly. He wanted to get to a neighboring town before spending the night, but in all probability he would have to spend the night here. This place was familiar to him. Not very pleasant memories from his life were connected with it. The man shuddered. He didn't want to bring it up. "I'll pull over somewhere on the side of the road to get out of here early in the morning," he said out loud. "It's been years since I've been here." The highway was empty. He didn't like music in the car, so he drove in complete silence. He kept thinking, touched his phone to look at the time. It was already late. He turned onto the highway that led to the city center. Suddenly, a car rushed ahead of him at full speed. The driver was startled. "What an idiot." Christopher cursed. He's sure to cause trouble on his own head. The car moved quickly toward the turn. The man decided to slow down a little so that the idiot would drive farther ahead. He thought the car had drifted into the curb. Then he heard a distinctive sound, became alert, saw the car stop, and a moment later drive off again. Christopher drove cautiously forward, curious, and looked toward the curb, where the crazy car had apparently stalled, and immediately noticed a man on the ground. "Oh my God." Christopher sprang to his feet. Did he hit him? His hands trembled. He quickly jumped out of the car and saw the woman. A bag and a suitcase lay beside her. One of her legs was bloody. "Hey, can you hear me?" He slapped the stranger across the face, but she wouldn't come to her senses. Oh God, not again. He called an ambulance. The woman might have fractures, and he was afraid to lift her. About 40 minutes later, flashers showed up. "She'd been hit," said Christopher. "I don't know her." Some idiot in front of her was speeding. I could see from a distance how he skidded over here. Apparently he hit her. The victim was taken to the emergency room. Christopher stood for a while and was about to get in the car. Suddenly a sound came from the bushes. The man climbed into the bushes and saw the phone. He immediately realized that the phone belonged to the woman who had been hit. Christopher hesitated for a few seconds, but then pressed the call. "Camille, what did you? Stephen said you saw him with his mistress. He agreed to the divorce." There was a woman's voice in the receiver. "I'm sorry," said Christopher, "but if this phone belongs to the person I'm thinking of, she's been taken to the hospital." "Who are you?" Lisa asked in horror. "Where's Camille? What happened to her?" She got worried. "She was hit by a car." The man answered calmly, "They've just taken her to the hospital. I beg you, please go to her." "Too," sobbed the woman. "I just gave birth to a baby and I'm lying in the maternity hospital. Maybe her husband hit her. She caught him with his mistress today. Oh my God. Or maybe she threw herself in front of the car." "No," Christopher answered right away. "Some asshole was speeding, lost control on a curve. Please help my friend." "God, why did she have to go through all this?" Lisa sobbed. "Call me, what's wrong with her?" "I'm begging you. I have to take the phone to her anyway." It flew off into the bushes, so it wasn't seen. A stranger answered it. "I'll call you from the hospital." Christopher really didn't want to get involved in this case, but he had been in a similar situation once. The man got into the car, and all his thoughts went somewhere far away, towards the past. Christopher had been caving and rock climbing since he was 14. He had a friend at school with whom they explored their first hills and caves. By the age of 25, Christopher could be called a true professional. He had been to some of the most famous places, but over time he realized that he enjoyed solo hiking. Sometimes he joined a group, but mostly he explored alone. The guy was specially trained as a programmer so that he could combine work at home with his favorite business. Time was running out, and one day Christopher met a girl on the internet. She turned out to be local. Before that he had already had acquaintances, but they did not end in anything serious. The young man has long lived on his own. His parents remained in the village, and he bought a small house on credit. He did not like living on floors. Miranda was not only attractive but also curious. Christopher took her with him several times, but very soon the girl realized that climbing some abandoned caves was not for her. Admiration quickly passed, and she moved into the house with Christopher and began, so to speak, to support their family hearth. Miranda worked as a waitress in a night bar. At first Christopher did not like it, but the girl was able to convince him that such earnings as she had, it is difficult to find in the city. Yes, they did pay well. The tips could be very large. "All right, but after we're married, you'll find something else," Christopher told her then. "Miranda, this is not the kind of work for a married woman." Their life together seemed very harmonious. Miranda would come in at 0700 and go to bed. And the young man worked all day long, so neither of them interfered much. They met usually at 6 o'clock at 19, when Miranda woke up. From time to time, Christopher would go off to do his research. That was the case this time. He had a 3-day weekend and decided to go to one cave by train. He had to get there at 0800 hours. One day would not have been enough time to see it, but it began to rain heavily and the road was very washed out. The young man was forced to go back. He arrived home the next morning, and a cool car near the house immediately caught his eye. Christopher deliberately didn't want to call Miranda so as not to wake her up. Who's that? A bad premonition pierced his heartstrings. He walked into the house and was horrified to find a strange man in his bed. He was sleeping with Miranda. "You're completely nuts all over the house," he shouted and pounced on his girlfriend's lover. "Get out." And he punched him. Christopher pulled the blanket off Miranda, who was completely naked, forcefully shoved her into the other room so that in 10 minutes you wouldn't be here. He swore bitch and punched the stranger in the face with his fist with all his might. "You're going to regret this." He threw him a hateful look. "You're dead." Half an hour later, Christopher sat on the bed and sobbed. The pain was unbearable. All his dreams of family life had been shattered in an instant. But then Christopher had no idea what awaited him in the near future. At around 6 in the evening, his phone rang. It was a classmate of Christopher's. "Christopher, go away quickly," Rick said excitedly. "I heard that the local gangsters here have opened a hunt for you. I know them. They're not sparing you. I heard a rumor that they're going to kill you tonight and burn your house down." Christopher didn't know that Miranda was sleeping with a local authority figure. And since in his mind everything here belonged to him, he would come to Christopher's house without hesitation. "I'm begging you to leave," repeated the voice in the phone once more. "Do you know how many people they've killed already?" Christopher hastily packed his belongings, taking his documents, his laptop. He also brought his hiking backpack, in which he stuffed food and water. At first, the man wanted to hitchhike to another town, but he still could not move quickly, even with his car. There was a chance that the bandits would find him. Then Christopher came up with an idea. He had surveyed the local hills many times. There was one deep cave, but one day, quite by accident, he discovered that there were numerous passages running from it. There was a secret door. Perhaps someone hid here in ancient times, and it was completely safe inside. There were 2 exits from the cave, and both were under the rubble of rocks, which visually seemed impassable. But by pushing on one of them, a small door could be opened. Inside, the purest water dripped down one of the walls, so it was possible to live here for a long time. Christopher carefully crept inside without anyone noticing him. It was already getting dark when he entered the familiar cave, opened the entrance, and lit a candle. He decided not to waste batteries on the flashlight first. Christopher threw his sleeping bag on the ground and tried to get comfortable. In half an hour, a pot of buckwheat porridge was already hanging over the fire. The man realized that the next few hours would be crucial for him. He carefully carried dry branches. The cave needed to be stocked with more. Then Christopher thought that he would stay in the cave for 2 or 3 days and go somewhere else for a while. But he ended up living there for almost 3 months until the whole thing settled down. In the meantime, at about 9 o'clock, 5 cars pulled up to Christopher's house. Men with guns jumped out of them. They broke down the door. They didn't find the owner. "Yes, he must have killed himself out of fear," laughed one with a big scar on his face. "Douse everything with gasoline," the chief ordered. "We'll wait for him here. He'll be back sooner or later anyway," to the fight and the hysterical laughter of the scoundrels. Christopher's house was burning. They were beating with joy as if they were in agony. 3 days later, the fugitive saw cars coming toward the hills. He immediately hid in his hiding place. The bandit and his dogs looked around. Christopher heard them barking. The man was insanely afraid that some dog would start to make a dig, and the bandits in that place could open a stone. It was the most terrifying moments of his life. But it was all right. He was so scared that he decided to stay in his cave for a couple of months. There was no problem with water, but he had to be very economical with his food. After 2 months, he dared to walk near the hills for the first time. There was no one around. He climbed up one of them and looked at the city below. Somewhere up there was his home. Christopher began to come out of his cave from time to time. That way he was able to fetch a bale of hay that he had stolen from a nearby field the night before. He picked mushrooms from wild blackberries, then came barberry for tea, to which he added strawberry leaves. 3 months passed when the man finally ventured out to his house. He was all overgrown, so it was very difficult to recognize him outwardly. Dawn slowly illuminated the long-burned ruins. Christopher stood in front of his house and could not come to his senses. Everything had burned to the ground. He had nothing else. The man decided to leave his hometown. He did not go to his parents either. One day he called them and warned them that he was fine, so that they would not worry. His mother told him that some jocks came to them, looking for him. Christopher put his backpack on his shoulders, took 2 bags, and went wherever he was going. "Okay, I think it's here too." He came to his senses and turned left. Here was the second hospital. The man glimpsed at his watch. It was almost. He went into the emergency room and explained the situation. Naturally, the victim didn't let him in. "If you want to know anything, wait. The doctor will come in the morning and tell you." The nurse replied dryly. "Yes, I need to pass the phone," he said. "I don't know this woman." "Well, if you want, leave it with me or wait for me yourself." That's all she said. She pretended to be doing important work. So Christopher went outside. "I guess I'll wait," he said to himself. All the more reason to call her friend. But the Lisa on the poster had fallen asleep. The man did not call her so late, settled down in his car, and fell asleep. At 6, he was awakened by Lisa. She woke up and immediately remembered what had happened to Camille. "I can't say anything yet." "Sleep," Christopher replied. "They wouldn't let me in last night. They said to wait for the doctor, and he doesn't come until 8 o'clock. So we have to wait." Please wait. Lisa begged him again. I'll pay you. Give me your card number. I'll wire you the money. I don't need anything. Christopher answered immediately. Let's calm down. All the more reason for you not to be nervous. I'll call you myself. He got out of the car, stretched. Birds were singing all around. There were tall poplars and ash trees near the hospital. The man thought. He had a new project to start in a day. After Christopher was left with nothing, he decided to move far away from his hometown to Moscow or Peter. He didn't want to, so he decided to stay in Krasnodar. There were many interesting places here. He still continued to pursue his hobby. 2 years later, he was found in social networks by Rick, a classmate. He told him that the authority, who was hunting him, was shot in some local squabbles. It was then that Christopher decided to come home for the first time. He had traveled to his parents' house several times before. Now Christopher had to go back to where his house used to be. Neighbors told him someone wanted to buy his ruin. The man went to the deal. Everything went well, and he decided to take a little walk through the hills that had once saved his life. In fact, Christopher was even grateful to life for the way things had turned out. He found a new job. 3 years later, he bought himself a house. But family life just wasn't working out for him. Christopher didn't want one. After Miranda's betrayal, he'd grown cold to women. His heart, of course, he would like love, but he had not yet met such a woman. Christopher went to his phone and began to think about his new job. He came to his senses when people started to gather at the hospital. It was already 7:45. A man got out of his car and headed for the entrance. Hello. He approached the head of the hospital. I'm here about the woman who was brought in at night. She was hit by a car. I want to give her my cell phone. I found it after they took her away. I'm afraid she won't need it much. The doctor was dry. She has amnesia. Probably temporary. I don't know yet. Thanks for the phone. I'll notify her relatives. Christopher asked me to call Lisa. The friend was in shock at the news, as she couldn't remember anything. Through tears, she said, God, poor Camille, what are we going to do now? I don't know. The doctor said he would call her relatives. Christopher replied, I'm sorry, there's nothing more I can do for you. He left the phone on the superintendent's desk. He was called and went to the patient's room. Christopher cautiously peeked into the room and saw the woman he had saved. She was staring blankly at the ceiling. His heart clenched. He left the ward, began to walk downstairs. An image of a long-forgotten story appeared in his mind. He had once saved a girl while hiding in his cave. He sat in his car and closed his eyes. He just dragged a bale of straw that was lying on a ledge. Christopher opened his secret door and was about to drag in his find when suddenly there was a crunch of twigs from above and something fell on the bale. Christopher jumped up and saw the man. He was amazed at how accurately the girl had hit the straw. If her flight path had been slightly different, she would have been guaranteed to fall down and crash or hit the platform with all her might, and no one would have given any guarantee that she could have survived. The stranger's hands and face were bloody. Christopher immediately realized that the broken branches had inflicted her wounds. He didn't know what to do with her for a while, even thought of hiding her in the cave. But something told him it was better to take her out into the open, and it was the right thing to do. After a while, voices were heard. Apparently, the stranger was being searched for. Christopher quickly took her in his arms and went into the cave. He walked down a long corridor and came to an open place. There were voices very close by. After a while, Christopher went back there and saw that the girl was no longer there. So she was found, he said to himself. This made him very happy, because he could not call an ambulance himself. He was in hiding, and it was a matter of life and death for him. Christopher started the car. Something inside him did not want to leave this woman. He remembered the words of her friend who spoke of her husband cheating on her. The man still at the scene gave a statement to the police. But since he essentially saw nothing, the car sped past him so quickly that there were no further questions for him. The car turned around and Christopher drove out of town. On the way, he wanted to stop by his parents' house. He hadn't visited them much lately. On the way, he kept thinking about the victim. Mom, I have something urgent to do. I'll come back later. He called and turned the car around and drove back. The man's mind was troubled. He had not been allowed into the intensive care unit, but he had somehow persuaded the superintendent. Christopher was sitting next to Camille, looking at him intently. "I happened to see you get hit yesterday." Christopher told her and called an ambulance. "Was your friend very worried about you?" "I don't remember anyone." The victim was barely audible. "What's your name?" she wondered. "Christopher, but we don't know each other." "We've never met before." He answered right away. "Your friend's name is Lisa. She just had a baby girl. She's in the hospital." "I don't remember," Camille said sadly. "I don't know anyone." "Will you stay with me?" Suddenly she asked. I was taken aback. "The doctor said your husband will be here soon." "I'll wait for him." "Don't leave me," Camille asked. "I don't remember anyone." "Are you a good man?" "You saved me." The man had no time to say anything when Camille, a handsome young man, rushed into the room. "Camille," he rushed to the victim. "What happened to you? Where have you been?" The woman was frightened and sent away from the stranger. There was pain in her eyes. Christopher watched in amazement at what was happening. "Who are you?" "I don't know you, woman, I don't know you. Don't touch me," she cried. "Camille, I am Stephen, your husband?" With pale lips he said. "Don't you remember me?" "No, leave me alone," Camille begged. "Christopher, please tell him to go away." Stephen only now saw that he was not alone in the room. He cast an angry glance at the stranger. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" He threw him a careless glance. "What do you want with my wife?" The superintendent stood up for the man and explained how he had saved Camille. Stephen did not like the man's presence. He asked him to leave so he could be alone with Camille. "Don't you remember anything?" A little cheering up in Camille's husband. "You don't remember our last conversation either? Maybe you remember Emily?" The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. The man was unpleasant to her. "Go away. I don't want to see you," she whispered. "I don't know you. Leave me alone." Stephen, satisfied, left the room. Christopher noticed the look in his eyes. It all seemed very strange to him. His wife had been in an accident, lost her memory, and he was smiling at something. Camille's husband noticed Christopher, and his expression changed immediately. "I am grateful for Camille, but I urge you not to bother my wife again." His eyes burned with hatred. "Go on. I can manage on my own." Christopher wanted to say goodbye to Camille, but Stephen wouldn't let him. The man didn't say anything, went downstairs and headed for his car. Some idiot was running around in his head. The woman doesn't realize who she is, and he has no sympathy for her at all. But that could be explained by the fact that he has a mistress and doesn't care about his wife. Bastard. Christopher stopped by his parents' house, but all his thoughts were on Camille. Her voice was always in his head. "Don't leave me, please," she begged him. The woman trusted him for some reason. "Maybe I'm responsible for her life now." He looked at his mother and father, to whom he had told everything. "Christopher, she has a husband. How can you go against him, whatever happens between them? You have nothing to do with her." His father answered him. The son realized that the father was right, but he had a strong concern for Camille. He felt for her as if she were a little child and he wanted to protect her. "It's strange," he thought as he went to bed. "I don't know her at all, and yet I feel a connection with her." Early the next day, Christopher left his parents' house and went to Krasnodar. He had to get back to his life. He had no idea at the time that this would not be the end of things with Camille. Christopher fully immersed himself in his project. He occasionally went to the Krasnodar region on weekends. He could not stay in one place for long, and since his next trip was scheduled for early August, he had to make do with little. From time to time, the man remembered the woman he had saved. He wanted very much to know if her memory had come back to her. But he hadn't put Camille's number or her friend's number in his phone, which he now regretted. "Go away. I don't want to see you." Camille sobbed when her husband came to see her. "Get Christopher. Where is he? Why did he leave? Please tell him to come back." "Who the hell is Christopher?" swore Stephen. "You're my wife. Do you understand? And you're starting to need me," he whispered angrily. Her parents came to see her, but she didn't recognize them either. Her mother and father wanted to take her to their house, but Stephen insisted that the conditions at home were better and he could pay for any doctors. Camille's hatred for her husband grew stronger every day. But she also realized that the day would come when she would be discharged from the hospital and would have to go with him. The victim recovered quickly. The only problem was her memory. Camille never regained consciousness. That dreadful day came. Camille was discharged. Stephen came to pick her up. The woman was hysterical. "I'm not going with him," she screamed. "Please let me stay here. I don't want to." But Camille could not be kept in the hospital any longer. She still had to go home. Stephen behaved very well with the doctor, but as soon as Camille crossed the threshold, he no longer played the loving husband. "Listen to me, you fool," he shouted. "Do you know how much nerve you've been shouting at me? Be thankful I didn't throw you out on the street. Did you really think you could humiliate me? I won't let anyone do that, and you're going to have to answer for the last time you talked to me." He punched his wife in the stomach with all his might. From that day on, Camille's life became a penal servitude. Stephen became furious. He developed a kind of inhuman hatred for his wife. She humiliated him by catching him with her mistress. Stephen was not the kind of man to allow his weaknesses and mistakes to be pointed out. Camille, after the last conversation, was his number one enemy, and the only thing he wanted to do was to hurt her. "You will answer for everything. My husband couldn't calm down. You'll be locked up for the rest of your life." It's a good thing she lost her memory. Now I can get back at her. She wanted to divorce me. She thought she could screw me. Go to hell. Nobody wants you but me. Camille was locked up all day long. Stephen put water and food in her room for the day. There was also a toilet bucket in the room. Metal bars appeared on the windows. At first Camille tried to scream, but first of all Stephen took her to the farthest room. In the second place, all the neighbors knew that Camille was not well with her head after the tragedy, so no one paid any attention to her. Naturally, she didn't have a cell phone. Stephen lied. Camille told his parents that she became very aggressive. Sometimes he invited them to visit. But since it always ended with the mother's hysterics, the girl's father suggested to go less often. Camille all this time tried hard to remember anything, but could not. The only thing that connected her with her past life was a strong feeling that her husband had hurt her. And soon that feeling was confirmed. One day Stephen came home drunk. He was very angry. Immediately he went to his wife's room. She was sitting on the bed, crying. "Well, is it time to work it off?" He laughed. "Do you think I feed you for nothing?" He moved closer to her, began to undress. Camille stared at him with mad eyes, jumped up from the bed, huddled in the corner. "No," screamed Camille, "don't touch me. Help me." She was terrified. "You idiot, you're my wife. You have to do this with me," Stephen said angrily and slapped her across the face. He enjoyed it so much that he beat Camille so much that she fainted. Then, satisfied with his work, he raped her. Stephen had always been cruel. It was just that his inhumanity grew and waited for the right moment. What happened to Camille was the trigger that opened the door to hell for him. He couldn't explain to himself why he hated his wife so much. But he crazily enjoyed the taste of violence. The day came and Camille realized she had to do something. Stephen threatened her that if she said a word to her parents, he would lock her up in a mental hospital. "These bruises and abrasions are self-inflicted. Do you understand? Did you fall?" he ordered her. Camille realized that it was useless to cry and ask for help. It would only fuel her husband's anger. "I must run," Camille pondered. "How can I do that?" She went to the windows. The longer Camille thought about it, the more she realized that there was no other way for her to escape. She looked around her room in her husband's absence and tried different ways to open the door. And one day a miracle happened. Somehow a rusty squirrel helped her open the door. The woman got out and looked around. Stephen usually arrived late. 3 times a week some woman came in, cleaned the house, and she had Camille handcuffed to a pipe. The woman didn't resist. She understood that she had to escape from the house without witnesses. There were bars on the other windows too, but the small bathroom window was unprotected. Camille waited until it was dark and walked to the bathroom. She was so thin that she could easily climb through the window. She had no special plan. She wanted only one thing to escape from this horrible house. Her husband had become a despot and a sadist. She didn't care where she went, as long as she got away from here. She climbed over the fence, went into one room, which apparently was once there. She found some jewelry, which she took with her. The passport wasn't there. Stephen had hidden it. He had taken complete control of his wife. Now she was his victim. He seemed to enjoy it immensely. Money, Alcohol, mistresses, power had corrupted him so much that he simply lost control of himself. Stephen finally broke up with Emily. Now he had another muse. He made his house a fortress. Lisa visited Camille several times, but her husband would not let her in under the pretext that she had become insane. In fact, it was he who was insane. But the man didn't notice it. Camille came out at the beginning of the street. She did not realize where she was going. It seemed to her that there was a highway ahead, so the woman headed that way. There were hardly any cars. Some honked at her, but she paid no attention to anyone. She walked and cried. Everything that had happened to her in the last months was like the 9 circles of hell. The biggest problem was her memory. If only she could remember, everything fell into place immediately. She quietly took the side of the road, approaching the spot where she'd been hit. Intuitively, she stopped. It all seemed familiar to her. Squatting down, she closed her eyes, the sound of brakes ringing in her ears. But she couldn't remember anything else. God, who am I? She raised her head to the sky. How can I go on living? Please help me. Several months passed, but Camille was still in Christopher's mind. One day he returned to his hometown and went to the doctor. When we discharged her, her memory never came back, the superintendent told him. I heard she was getting worse. She was having mental problems. Has she lost her mind? The guest asked bluntly. Strange, if she had been insane, it would have been obvious right away. But she was perfectly sane. She just didn't remember anything. Christopher was very anxious to see Camille. He drove towards her house. A man got the nurse's information for money. She went through the archives and wrote him the address of the victim. Christopher knocked on the wicket, calling for the owners, but no one came out. He turned around and drove back to his parents' house in frustration. Some more time passed, but peace did not return to him. He went in search of Camille again. It was already late when he reached the town. He didn't have much time, so he decided to spend the night at the hospital and knock on her door again early in the morning. Christopher was approaching the ill-fated turnoff. At first, it looked like there was something lying on the curb. Then it rose to its full height, and he saw a woman. His whole body shook. He came around the bend and stopped. Wait. He ran after the stranger. What's your name? You're Camille. Please stop. I saved a woman here. The man stopped abruptly. There was silence. The woman cautiously approached him. Are you Christopher? She asked. Did you save me? IA. She was silent. She was very worried. Yes, I'm Christopher. Are you Camille? He came closer and looked at her face. It was covered in bruises. Her lips were smashed. What happened to you? The man was horrified. Were you in an accident again? No. She lowered her head. It's my husband who beats me. First he beats me until I pass out, and then he rapes me. Oh shit, scolded Christopher. Did you run away from him? He looked at Camille in horror. Yes, she cried. I can't do this anymore. Help me, please. She rushed to him. I trust you. Christopher did not have much time. He quickly grabbed the woman's hand and led her to the car. They turned around and drove towards Krasnodar. At first, Camille only cried, and then she fell asleep. Christopher stole glances at her. His heart clenched with pain. What a bastard, he cursed to himself. Not a man, just a wimp. No real man would ever lay a hand on a woman. Coward. The farther they drove away from the city, the more Christopher realized that he would not let Camille offend him again. I'll do anything to make her come to her senses. I won't give her to him. We'll take the beatings right away. I'll ask Seryoga to help. The man pondered. He realized that Camille had no documents with her. Nevertheless, they could take a picture of her and record a statement that could be presented later. Stephen drove home with a smile. Today, he and the guys had a good time in the sauna. Money could buy anything. Lately, Stephen had indulged in total debauchery and then came over and abused his wife. Inflicting pain on Camille gave him great pleasure. Now I'll have fun with her, he thought dreamily. Let her know her place. He drove into the yard, barely got out of the car. Each time he was drinking more and more alcohol. He turned on the light and noticed the open door to Camille's room. He cursed profanely and looked for her. Not immediately, he noticed the open window in the bathroom. Those bastards. He was tearing up. She'd escaped. He ran all over the house. At first he wanted to call the police, but then he realized his wife couldn't have gone anywhere without papers, so he calmed down and went to bed. By 7 a.m., Christopher and Camille arrived at his house. He immediately organized her bath. He had no women's clothes, so for now he gave his guest his jeans and a t-shirt. The woman was very thin. Christopher looked at her with sympathy. "Camille, they're going to start looking for you." "I have no doubt that your husband will go to the police," Christopher told her. "So you will have to stay at home for the time being." "Can you do that?" "Yeah, I've been locked up for months, so I'm okay with that," she sighed. "You're not going to lock me in my room, are you?" Christopher shook his head. He had made sure Camille was all right. Now he had to go to the store and the drugstore. When he returned, the woman was asleep. Jesus, how could they beat her like that? Tears streamed from his eyes. Camille looked like an innocent child. Christopher made dinner. While the woman slept, he wanted to do something for her. The guests woke up just as he was setting the table. "Camille, let's have lunch, and then we'll decide what to do." Christopher smiled. They ate in silence, clearing the table. They felt much better at Christopher's house. She was sure she could trust him. "Camille will file a police report," Christopher suggested. "Otherwise, your husband will continue to abuse you." "Christopher, if I do that, he will deny everything," she sighed. "He has money, so he can buy me out." "Then we'll just go out for a while to see a better opportunity," the man suggested. "You'll stay with me for now, and in a week or two I'll talk to an acquaintance of mine." Christopher again made sure that the sled was all right. Yes, she had a lapse in her memory, but it did not affect her thinking in any way. The man helped her treat her wounds, set to work. The guest retired to another room. Christopher turned on the television in the hope that she might remember something. Almost a week went by like that. Camille did things around the house. Christopher occasionally went shopping. The woman liked his presence, and he didn't mind her. "Camille, let's have a little party," he suggested. "I'll make a quick trip for the cake." "What's the occasion?" she smiled. "Is it your birthday?" She looked at him questioningly. "But it's been 4 months since I saved you." "Such an event should be celebrated," he said. They talked like old friends that day, and there was not much to tell. So she listened to Christopher. He told her the story of Miranda and how he was hiding in the cave. Camille watched him with interest. "Once a girl flew to me from the sky." Christopher laughed. "Literally. She must have fallen down the hill and onto the straw. That's why she survived. I carried her in afterward. They were looking for her there." And suddenly Camille felt her body pass through the tree branches that had left wounds on her body. She shuddered. "Camille, what are you doing?" The man looked worriedly at her. "Are you sick?" He poured juice into her glass. "Christopher, I feel like I've heard about this story before." She tried to remember. He held his breath. Camille took about 10 minutes to recall the details, but all to no avail. Then Christopher told her the story again in great detail, and again she felt the leaves sliding down her arms. But it went no further than that. That night Camille lay in bed and felt herself falling downwards. Then the branches hit her face and she felt pain. She fell asleep with that feeling. 3 more days passed and Camille started cleaning. Vlad went on a business trip. He still wanted to find a way out for her. He stopped by an acquaintance of his who worked in the police force. He could trust him. It wouldn't be easy, the friend said right away. He's her legal husband and representative. So proving he beat and raped her would be difficult. If he was a neighbor, that's a different story. It turns out that she is his thing. Christopher sighed. He can do whatever he wants with her. But that's not true either. No one will just give it to you. At most you can arrange with her parents to visit her, the policeman said. Camille climbed onto the table. She wanted to wipe the chandelier. Carefully she ran a wet rag over the background. Suddenly she looked down. It seemed to her that she was standing on a hill and the lights of the evening city were burning below. For a moment she felt she remembered something. She felt dizzy and fell and hit the table leg. When Christopher arrived home, Camille was still lying on the floor. He rushed over to her, picked her up in his arms, and put her on the bed. Immediately he pulled out the first aid kit, took out ammonia and alcohol. After a minute Camille opened her eyes, everything in front of her spinning. I can't focus." "Everything's doubled over," she whispered. "Water?" Camille asked. Christopher immediately brought her a glass and helped her to drink. Camille was still lying with her eyes closed. He sat next to her. After about 5 minutes, he saw tears running down her cheeks. "Camille, what's the matter with you?" He was frightened. "Are you in pain? Let's call an ambulance." "Christopher, it was me," Camille whispered to that girl flying down the hill. "I remembered." The man swallowed a big lump. He didn't know what to say. He sat quietly and waited. "That day, Stephen wanted to rape me. We were in the same class," she said. "He came up behind me, so I didn't see him. But the day I left him and got hit, he told me all about it." "Thank you. You saved me twice?" "No, 3 times." She finally opened her eyes. "Camille, it turns out that it was you who fell down the hill when I was hiding in the cave?" Christopher asked in amazement. "Oh my God, how is that possible? When Stephen found me first, he told me all about pulling me out of the ravine," she continued. "He was always running after me at school. But not only was Stephen very arrogant, he was also cruel. The whole thing was to his advantage. He became a real hero, and I bought his lies in gratitude. We started dating calf 5-6. He really was the perfect guy. I easily agreed to marry him, even though I had some doubts. He turned me into a thing. Stephen's father had several stores. I don't know what else they did, but they had a lot of money after we got married. Stephen wouldn't let me work. It was like living in a golden cage. But after a few years, he started drinking. And then I smelled him wearing women's perfume. The day I was hit by a car, I was on my way to my friend's maternity hospital, and I saw my husband near the mall. He was rocking a stroller for his 2 children. Then his mistress ran up to him. In the evening, I told him everything. Naturally, he framed it as if I was an ungrateful fool, that it was normal to have a mistress. He accused me of luring him into my net and marrying him for money. He said a lot of things and admitted that nobody wanted me. That's why he wanted to rape me. I didn't know what to do. I took my bags and I went wherever I was going. I got hit by a car, and then you know what happened? Camille, I don't understand. Why did he hit you? Christopher asked in confusion. But if he didn't love you, what was the point? Self-love. He looked like a lowlife in my eyes. That he couldn't stand, she replied. Stephen was just taking revenge on me. He beat me with great pleasure. He thought he was defeating his worst enemy every time, not bullying a defenseless woman. I will never understand such a thing, and I don't want to. Christopher jumped up. Camille, something has to be done about this. You can't stay his wife. What happened to me just now, and I remember it all, is like a bad dream to him. Stephen thought he would always have power over me with impunity. She looked the man in the eye. I'll fight, even though he's more likely to pay me off. But everyone must know about this story. People like him must remember that the moment will come and they will have to answer for everything. The worst thing for Stephen is to appear in the eyes of others as a man who is wrong. He has always been a saint to others. He condescended to marry someone as simple as me. And then he provided for her. After all, a family man like Stephen couldn't let his wife work. She had to be the keeper of the hearth. He lives in some kind of delusional world, said Christopher. Such people are schizophrenic by nature. They simultaneously feel that they are the rulers of the world and at the same time have the greatest fear. Camille stood up and walked to the window. She remembered everything, but her memories brought her more pain. Now she had to make an effort to cope with it. Make a lake, I promised you. I'll pay you any money, just find her. Asked his roofie alias Stephen. He's already got the whole police on his ass. Dad's even got the FSB involved. Stephen had become afraid that Camille had disappeared. Sure, he was overconfident, but somewhere inside he realized that she might have told someone about what he was doing to her. Stephen had been so angry lately that nothing could satisfy him. He went to his mistress. The girl was already waiting for him, happily throwing herself around his neck. Stephen removed his passion, and he felt better. But still the inner tension seemed to tear his beloved. What's going on? His lover asked him. Are you so sad? Didn't you like it? No, I'm fine. It's cold, he replied. I'm not in the mood. Leave me alone. You always say that, Stephen pouted his lips. I love you. I can't do without you. It's your wife. God, I can't wait till she's dead somewhere. Stephen turned around and slapped her across the face with all his might. He swore and sent the girl away. "Shut your mouth," he ordered. "Mind your own business, you stupid fool. If you talk about my wife again," he didn't finish. He dressed quickly and left the apartment. Stephen felt as if some bloodthirsty monster was sitting in him, which was always demanding a new victim. Sanka Yi was easy. Her husband could do whatever he wanted to her, but he couldn't behave like that with his mistress. Angry, he returned home. To his surprise, there was a light on in the house. He entered quickly. Camille was sitting on a chair in the hall. "What's back?" Angrily, he threw to her. "Do you know how much trouble you've caused me?" He tried to impress her. In fact, he was glad because he realized that he was going to enjoy himself immensely. His wife was silent. She looked directly into his eyes. Stephen quickly took off his shirt, pulled his belt out of his pants, "And now I'll show you how to go full throttle against me," he shouted. "Don't." Camille covered her face with her hands. "Please don't hit me." She tried to provoke her husband even more. "Now I'll show you what to do with creatures like you," he yelled, and Camille felt a blow on the hand she was using to cover her face. Stephen grabbed her and threw her to the floor with all his might. There were voices behind him. The police had entered the house. "Get him quickly," the captain ordered. "Bring witnesses," he added. The whole team was watching what was happening outside the window. Besides, Camille had a mini camera on her clothes, so all of Stephen's actions were witnessed. Christopher ran over to the woman, helped her up, treated the wound on her arm from the belt with green. All this time Stephen was shouting something, threatening that everyone would be imprisoned, that his father and the FSB would soon arrive. They immediately opened a criminal case against him. "Just so you know, I remembered everything," his wife came up to him. "So now I can testify to everything." "You lying bitch. You're mentally ill," he yelled. "You fool. Do you know what you'll get for this?" "Yes," she answered calmly. "Divorce and compensation for physical and moral damage." And she also looked intently into his eyes. "I have a witness. He can confirm that you wanted to rape me that summer." "Did he see you?" Camille cleaned up a little. "He's the one who brought me to the clearing. You weren't even looking for me. You just waved a flashlight around our camp because you've always been a coward." "Shut up. Trying to get away, stupid asshole. I should have pushed you that time with all my might. Then you'd have gone down the ravine for sure. I hate you." Camille would provoke her husband and he'd reveal all his cards in anger. The cops wrote everything down. They didn't even have to interrogate him. An hour later, Stephen's father showed up at the house. He, too, threatened everyone with his cocky nose, called someone all the time, waited for the FSB, but for some reason they did not come. The case was handled by Krasnodar because Camille filed a complaint with them. The local police didn't get involved. "I'll put you in jail for slander." Stephen wouldn't stop. All his arguments were exhausted. Stephen was given 5 years, but his father still managed to anoint him. And on retrial, he was given a suspended sentence. He paid Camille a huge sum of money for violence and moral damage. The case also dealt with the events of 10 years ago. As soon as Camille went missing, her parents immediately started looking for her through various search groups. The mother immediately said that once her daughter was found, they would take her home. She then said the same thing to Stephen when they found out about everything and could not believe it. Their son-in-law was actually a real monster. Christopher accompanied Camille all this time. He helped her with everything. After her divorce, he had to come home. He had already neglected all his business for a long time, but the man was glad that things were getting better for Camille. She stayed with her parents. A month passed. Camille and Christopher called each other from time to time. The man realized that Camille was very close to him, but after what she had been through, he did not know how to admit it to him. Camille herself felt that the trust she had felt in Christopher from the very first day of their acquaintance had not deceived her. The man was first and foremost a friend to her, someone she could talk to about anything. There was something else she had never experienced with Stephen. It was caring. Camille now knew exactly the difference between a sincere desire to care for someone and the ostentatiousness that her husband displayed. Gradually, Camille came to her senses. At that time, she had only one wish to get away from there. Everything in the city reminded her of Stephen. Besides, she had crossed paths with him several times. He called her names, threatened to take revenge. Camille was no longer afraid of him, but she had no desire to meet this disgusting man. Christopher sat in the kitchen, remembering the days when Camille had lived with him. It had been the best time of his life. "I want to be with her," he said. "I love her. I just wish she'd say yes." So Christopher took a risk, drove to her place unannounced. He knew where her parents lived. Let it go the way it should go, he said to himself. I'll tell her the way it is. Let her decide for herself. He knocked on the wicket. A few minutes later, Camille appeared on the porch. It was raining in the fall, and it was already chilly. "Christopher," she exclaimed happily, "how glad I am to see you." "Come in." "Camille, wait." He took her hand. "I love you. I want us to be together." They stood in the rain. Their eyes glistened with joy. Camille's hair was all over, but she was smiling. "I love you too." She touched his face with her hand. "I wanted you to be the first to tell me that." Christopher put his arms around her, pulled her close to him. At last he had found his happiness. Camille's mother's voice was heard. She called them into the house. There was no wedding. Camille and Christopher just signed the papers and sat with their parents. Both were very happy that their children had found each other. To her husband's surprise, Camille took an interest in photography and traveled with him constantly. Caves, as they were for Christopher, became her element. 2 years passed and the couple sat on the veranda of their Krasnodar home. They had recently returned from their next trip. Camille was told by her husband, "The cave is good, but we should think about our ministry." "Camille, I want children." Camille was the happiest woman in the world. She never pressured Christopher, waiting for him to come to this moment. The next day, Camille woke up and immediately laughed out loud. Her husband looked at her in bewilderment. "Camille, what are you doing?" "He killed his wife." "You had a good dream. Come on, tell me." She nodded her head. "Christopher, did the universe hear your wish? Prepare for what?" He didn't understand. "Great adventures await us." He stroked his wife's head. "I dreamed that I was holding 3 huge carp in my hands. They were alive." She laughed. "Well, Christopher, get ready. Apparently, you're going to be a daddy of many children." "I'm all for it." My husband was thrilled. "Camille, it's such a blessing. I wonder who we'll have." "Well, it's hard to tell the sex of the carp." "I felt them." Filled with laughter, wife. "Then let's guess for ourselves," suggested Christopher. 2 boys and 1 girl, or 2 girls and 1 boy. How shall we see?" Camille smiled. And in 2 years they already had 2 sons. And after 3 more they had a younger son,